The prescription bottle trembled in Marcus Chen's weathered hands as he stared at the intricate medical caduceus tattoo wrapped around the pharmacist's wrist. Time seemed to freeze in the bustling Mercy General Pharmacy as memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. That wasn't just any medical symbol. It was identical to the one Tommy Rodriguez had shown him 6 years ago in a dusty tent in Afghanistan, just hours before the explosion that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The pharmacist, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the customer before her, continued counting pills with practiced precision. But Marcus couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process how this was possible. Tommy was dead. He had died pulling Marcus from that burning vehicle, his medic bag still clutched in his hands as shrapnel tore through the desert air. So how was his distinctive tattoo now staring back at Marcus from behind a pharmacy counter in Riverside, Colorado? The autumn air in Riverside, Colorado carried the familiar bite of approaching winter as Marcus Chen pushed through the glass doors of Mercy General Pharmacy. The electronic chime announced his arrival to a moderately busy Tuesday afternoon crowd, the kind of steady flow that kept small-town pharmacies humming with quiet efficiency. Marcus moved with the deliberate gait of someone whose body remembered battles his mind tried to forget, his right leg carrying just enough stiffness to mark him as a veteran of conflicts most civilians only saw on evening news. At 34, Marcus had found a comfortable rhythm in his post-military life, working as a maintenance supervisor at the local community college. The work was honest, straightforward, and mercifully predictable, qualities he had learned to value after years of uncertainty in combat zones. His Tuesday routine was as reliable as clockwork. Finish the morning shift, grab lunch at Eddie's Diner, then stop by the pharmacy to pick up his monthly prescriptions before heading home to his small apartment overlooking the Riverside Community Park. The pharmacy itself was a study in small-town Americana, with its polished white floors reflecting fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. Shelves lined with everything from vitamins to greeting cards created narrow aisles that guided customers toward the back counter, where pharmacists worked behind protective glass partitions. The familiar scent of antiseptic, mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from the adjacent cafe, created an oddly comforting atmosphere that reminded Marcus of the sterile efficiency he'd known in military medical facilities, but without the underlying tension of emergency care. Behind him, the steady stream of afternoon customers created a gentle buzz of conversation and activity. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, whom Marcus recognized from his regular visits, shuffled slowly down the vitamin aisle with her walker, reading labels with the careful attention of someone managing multiple health conditions. A young mother wrestled with a toddler who seemed determined to grab every colorful package within reach, while her older child stood patiently beside the cart, already learned in the art of waiting. Marcus took his place in line behind two other customers, his mind wandering to the evening's plans. He'd promised himself he'd finally tackle the leaky faucet in his kitchen, a task he'd been postponing for weeks, with the kind of procrastination that comes from having too much quiet time to think. The simple act of fixing something tangible appealed to him more than most people understood. There was clarity in problems that could be solved with the right tools and enough persistence. The pharmacy counter stretched across the back of the store, divided into 3 service windows where staff members worked with the focused efficiency of healthcare professionals. Computer screens glowed with patient information, while printers hummed steadily, producing the labels that would accompany carefully counted medications. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, blending with the soft conversations between pharmacists and customers, discussing dosages, side effects, and insurance coverage. Marcus pulled out his phone to check the time, noting that he was running slightly ahead of schedule for once. The text message from his supervisor about tomorrow's boiler inspection could wait until he got home, another small luxury of civilian life that he never took for granted. No more urgent radio chatter, no more emergency briefings that could change everything in seconds. Just the quiet predictability of maintenance schedules and routine repairs. The customer ahead of him, a middle-aged man in a business suit, tapped his credit card impatiently against his leg while waiting for his prescription to be filled. His obvious frustration with the 5-minute wait struck Marcus as almost amusing. 6 years ago, waiting 5 minutes for anything would have felt like a gift. Time moved differently in combat zones, where seconds stretched into eternities during firefights and hours compressed into heartbeats during medical emergencies. As the line moved forward, Marcus found himself studying the motivational posters scattered around the pharmacy walls. Images of sunrises over mountains accompanied inspirational quotes about perseverance and healing, the kind of generic positivity that healthcare facilities seemed to favor. One poster featured a quote about courage being found in unexpected places, and Marcus smiled slightly at the irony. Courage, in his experience, was often found in the most ordinary moments, not in the dramatic gestures that made headlines, but in the quiet decisions to keep going when everything inside screamed to stop. The pharmacy's background music played softly, an inoffensive blend of contemporary instrumental pieces designed to be calming without being distracting. It was the kind of music that existed purely to fill silence, creating an audio cushion that made waiting feel less oppressive. Marcus had learned to appreciate these small comforts of civilian life, the way businesses went out of their way to make mundane experiences pleasant. His prescriptions were routine now. Medication for the persistent pain in his right leg where shrapnel had found its mark, and the sleep aids that helped quiet the memories that came alive in the dark hours of night. The doctors at Pine Ridge Veterans Hospital had assured him that both were normal parts of recovery, though recovery seemed like an optimistic word for what felt more like adaptation. He'd learned to function around the limitations, to build a life that accommodated the invisible wounds that came. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm home with so many veterans. The electronic beeping of barcode scanners provided a steady rhythm as pharmacy technicians processed prescriptions and managed inventory. The sound was comforting in its consistency, part of the technological symphony that kept modern healthcare functioning smoothly. Marcus had always been fascinated by systems and processes, perhaps because they represented order in a world that had shown him how quickly chaos could take control. A young couple near the cold medicine aisle debated the merits of different cough syrups, with the earnest concern of new parents facing their first winter with a baby. Their whispered consultation brought a small smile to Marcus's face as he remembered his own parents' careful attention to every sniffle and scrape during his childhood. There was something universal about the desire to heal and protect, whether it was parents caring for children or medics caring for soldiers in distant lands. The line moved again, bringing Marcus one step closer to the counter, where he would collect his monthly medications and return to his predictable routine. He glanced around the pharmacy once more, taking in the familiar sights and sounds that had become part of his weekly rhythm. The normalcy of it all still felt like a minor miracle some days, the simple act of standing in line at a pharmacy in Colorado, safe and stable and alive. Behind the counter, pharmacy staff moved with practiced efficiency, their white coats pristine as they counted pills and verified prescriptions. Each wore their expertise like armor, confident in their ability to manage the complex dance of modern pharmaceutical care. It was a world Marcus had come to know well during his recovery, filled with people who had dedicated their lives to healing others in ways both large and small. The afternoon light streaming through the pharmacy's large windows cast everything in a golden glow that spoke of autumn's progression toward winter. Soon the mountains that ringed Riverside would be covered in snow, and the town would settle into the quiet rhythm of cold months when people gathered close and communities pulled together. Marcus had found unexpected comfort in the changing seasons, in the way nature provided clear markers of time's passage without the urgency and unpredictability that had once defined his days. As he waited, Marcus allowed himself a moment of gratitude for the ordinary nature of this moment. Standing in line at a pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon, worried about nothing more pressing than a leaky faucet and tomorrow's work schedule, felt like a gift he was still learning to unwrap. The peace of routine, the luxury of boredom, the simple miracle of being alive and whole enough to complain about waiting in line. These were the victories that civilian life offered to those who had learned not to take them for granted. The customer ahead of him finished his transaction and moved away from the counter, gathering his medication and receipt with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose biggest problem had just been solved. Marcus stepped forward, already reaching for his wallet and the insurance card that would smooth his own transaction. Just another routine stop in another routine day, exactly the kind of predictable normalcy he had once dreamed about during long nights in places where tomorrow was never guaranteed. The pharmacist behind the counter looked up with a professional smile, ready to help the next customer in line. And in that moment, as Marcus prepared to state his name and birthdate like he had dozens of times before, he had no idea that his carefully constructed world of routine and predictability was about to be shattered by a tattoo that should have been buried 6 years ago in the red dust of Afghanistan. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her white pharmacy coat as she looked up to greet the next customer, her movements carrying the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of pharmaceutical care. At 31, she had built a reputation at Mercy General Pharmacy as one of the most thorough and compassionate pharmacists in Riverside, known for taking extra time to explain medications and genuinely caring about her patients' well-being. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her warm brown eyes held the kind of focused attention that made customers feel heard and valued. As she reached for the computer keyboard to begin processing the next prescription, her sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing something that most customers never noticed: an intricately detailed medical caduceus tattoo that wrapped around her left wrist like a bracelet. The design was far from typical. Instead of the standard simplified medical symbol, this one featured elaborate details that told a story in ink. 2 serpents intertwined around a winged staff, but these serpents had scales that formed tiny words in a language that looked like Pashto script. The wings weren't generic feathers but were crafted to resemble the helicopter blades that had carried wounded soldiers to safety, and at the base of the staff, almost hidden in the shadowing, were GPS coordinates that would mean nothing to most observers. The tattoo had been created by a master artist in Denver 3 years ago, each element carefully chosen to honor a memory that Sarah carried like a sacred trust. The Pashto words, painstakingly researched and verified, translated to healing hands and brother's keeper, phrases that had taken on profound meaning during her time as an army medic stationed at Forward Operating Base Thunder in Afghanistan's Kandahar province. The helicopter blade wings represented the countless medical evacuations she had participated in, rushing wounded soldiers from battlefield to surgery in those precious golden hours when speed meant the difference between life and death. But it was the GPS coordinates that held the deepest significance. They marked the exact location where her world had changed forever, where she had made a split-second decision that had saved one life and, in a way, ended another. The numbers were burned into her memory with the kind of precision that trauma creates, each digit as clear and permanent as the day she had first seen them on her mission briefing 6 years ago. Sarah had chosen to place the tattoo on her wrist, specifically because she wanted to see it every day as she worked, a constant reminder of why she had left the military to pursue civilian medicine. During her deployment, she had been known as Doc Rodriguez, a nickname that had followed her through basic training and medical school, earned through a combination of her surgical precision and her ability to remain calm under the most extreme pressure. Her fellow soldiers had trusted her with their lives, and she had carried that responsibility with the kind of fierce dedication that defined the best military medics. The transition from battlefield medicine to pharmacy work might have seemed like a step backward to some, but for Sarah it represented a different kind of healing. In the chaos of combat medicine, success was often measured in minutes and heartbeats, in the difference between critical and stable, between evacuation and loss. Behind the pharmacy counter, she could focus on long-term wellness, on helping people manage chronic conditions and maintain quality of life. It was healing on a different timeline, but no less important. Her colleagues at Mercy General knew she was a veteran. The disciplined way she organized her workspace and her unflappable composure during busy periods made that obvious. But few knew the specific details of her service, and none knew about the particular mission that had led to her leaving the military earlier than planned. The tattoo was her private memorial, a way of carrying forward the memory of someone who had deserved to come home, but never got the chance. The design had required multiple sessions with the tattoo artist, not because of its complexity, but because Sarah had needed time between appointments to process the emotions that creating this permanent tribute brought up. Each session had been a form of therapy, a way of transforming grief and survivor's guilt into something visible and meaningful. The artist, himself a veteran, had understood the weight of what he was creating and had worked with Sarah to ensure that every element was perfect. Most days, the tattoo remained hidden beneath her pharmacy coat, visible only when she reached for supplies on high shelves or when she rolled up her sleeves to wash her hands. It had become such a natural part of her that she rarely thought about it consciously. It was simply there, like a scar or a birthmark, integrated into her sense of self. Occasionally, observant customers would catch a glimpse and ask about it, usually assuming it was a standard medical symbol appropriate for someone in healthcare. Sarah had developed a standard response for such inquiries, a brief explanation about her military medical background and her continued commitment to healing. It was true without being complete, honoring the memory behind the tattoo without opening wounds that had taken years to begin healing. Most people were satisfied with this surface explanation, and those who weren't were usually polite enough not to push for more personal details. The pharmacy's afternoon rush was beginning to build, with customers arriving to pick up prescriptions after work and school. Sarah moved efficiently between tasks, her hands steady as she counted pills and verified dosages. The tattoo caught the fluorescent lighting as she worked, the detailed inkwork creating subtle shadows that gave the design depth and movement. To anyone watching closely, it was clear that this wasn't a casual decision or an impulsive choice. This was art, created with intention and maintained with care. Behind the professional competence and warm bedside manner, Sarah carried the same hypervigilance that marked many combat veterans. She was always aware of her surroundings, always ready to shift from routine to emergency mode if the situation demanded it. The skills that had made her an exceptional combat medic, rapid assessment, quick decision-making, grace under pressure, served her well in civilian healthcare, even if the stakes were usually lower. Her coworkers respected her clinical knowledge and relied on her judgment when complex medication interactions arose or when customers presented with concerning symptoms. Sarah had a gift for reading between the lines of what patients said, for noticing the subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. It was a skill set forged in environments where missing a detail could be fatal, refined through years of making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information. The afternoon light streaming through the pharmacy windows illuminated the tattoo as Sarah reached for a bottle on the upper shelf, the intricate details becoming momentarily more visible. The serpents seemed to move in the shifting light, their scales catching and reflecting the illumination like tiny mirrors. For just a moment, the careful artistry was fully revealed. Not just a medical symbol, but a memorial, a promise, and a burden, all wrapped together in permanent ink. As she returned to the counter with the medication, Sarah pulled her sleeve back down, returning the tattoo to its usual concealment. It was an unconscious gesture, performed without thought, the way someone might adjust their collar or smooth their hair. The memorial returned to its private space, hidden but not forgotten, carried forward into another routine interaction with another customer who needed her professional expertise. The pharmacy's computer system chimed softly as Sarah processed prescriptions, each transaction representing someone's trust in her knowledge and competence. She took that trust seriously, checking and double-checking dosages, looking for potential interactions, making sure that each customer understood their medication regimen. It was careful, methodical work that honored the precision she had learned in military medicine, while serving the different but equally important goals of civilian healthcare. Behind her, other pharmacy staff members moved through their own routines, creating the coordinated efficiency that kept the operation running smoothly. Sarah had learned to work as part of a team long before she arrived at Mercy General, and her ability to anticipate what colleagues needed and coordinate complex tasks without confusion made her a valued member of the staff. Leadership came naturally to her, though she wore it lightly in this civilian context. The tattoo represented more than just memory. It was a bridge between her military identity and her civilian life, a way of honoring her past while embracing her future. Every day that she helped customers manage their health conditions, every interaction where her medical knowledge made a difference in someone's quality of life, she was fulfilling the promise embedded in those carefully chosen symbols. The healing continued, just in a different form and at a different pace. As the afternoon progressed, and more customers lined up for service, Sarah remained focused on her work, unaware that among those waiting was someone whose life had been directly touched by the events commemorated in her tattoo. The GPS coordinates inked into her skin marked a place and time that had changed multiple lives forever, and the convergence of past and present was about to unfold in ways that neither she nor the patient waiting in line could have anticipated. The dismissal Jake Williams checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes, his impatience growing with each passing second as the line at Mercy General Pharmacy crawled forward at what felt like an glacial pace. A successful insurance adjuster in his early 40s, Jake was accustomed to efficiency and quick resolution, qualities that seemed to be in short supply at this particular moment. His tailored business suit and polished leather shoes marked him as someone who valued time as a commodity, and the casual Tuesday afternoon pace of small-town pharmacy service was testing his patience. Behind Jake stood Linda Thompson, a local real estate agent who had stopped by to pick up her blood pressure medication before her next client appointment. Linda was known throughout Riverside for her ability to close deals and her tendency to view every interaction through the lens of social networking. She had been conducting a loud phone conversation about property values when she first noticed the man ahead of her in line, the one with the slight limp and the worn baseball cap, who seemed content to wait indefinitely for his prescription. "Some people act like they have all day," Jake muttered under his breath, loud enough for those around him to hear, but not quite loud enough to be confrontational. His comment was directed at Marcus, who stood patiently in front of him, seemingly unbothered by the weight that was driving Jake to distraction. To Jake's businessman mindset, Marcus's relaxed demeanor suggested someone without pressing responsibilities or important places to be. Linda Thompson ended her phone call and immediately picked up on Jake's frustration, seeing an opportunity for the kind of casual conversation that helped her build community connections. "Tell me about it," she said, matching Jake's volume and tone. "You'd think with all the technology they have these days, filling a prescription wouldn't take forever." She glanced toward Marcus with the kind of dismissive look that suggested she was including him in her critique of inefficiency. Marcus was indeed taking his time, but not out of inconsideration. Years of military discipline had taught him the value of patience, and his post-service therapy had reinforced the importance of not letting external pressures dictate his internal state. He had learned to use waiting periods as opportunities for mindfulness, for staying present in the moment rather than rushing toward the next obligation. The irony that his calm presence was irritating those behind him wasn't lost on him, but he wasn't about to let their impatience disrupt his hard-won peace. "Look at him just standing there," Jake continued, his voice carrying the edge of someone who felt his time was being wasted by others' inefficiency. "Probably doesn't have anywhere important to be. Must be nice to have that kind of luxury." His assumption was that Marcus represented the kind of person who lacked drive or ambition, someone content to drift through life without the urgency that characterized successful people. Linda nodded in agreement, though her motivations were different from Jake's pure impatience. As someone who built her business on reading people and understanding social dynamics, she was making mental notes about everyone in line. The man in the baseball cap struck her as unremarkable, possibly unemployed or underemployed, definitely not someone who moved in the social circles that drove her real estate business. His casual clothes and patient demeanor suggested someone outside the professional network she cultivated. "I mean, come on," Jake said, gesturing toward the pharmacy counter where Sarah was methodically processing prescriptions. "How long does it take to count pills and stick them in a bottle?" This isn't rocket science. His business background had given him a low tolerance for processes that couldn't be streamlined or optimized, and the careful attention that pharmacy work required struck him as unnecessarily cumbersome. Behind Linda, an elderly gentleman named Harold Peterson listened to the complaints with the kind of weary recognition that came from decades of observing human nature. Harold was a Korean War veteran who had learned patience in circumstances far more challenging than a pharmacy line, and the casual dismissal of the man ahead of them triggered memories of his own experiences being underestimated and overlooked. But Harold kept his observations to himself, understanding that some lessons could only be learned through direct experience. Marcus was fully aware of the growing frustration behind him, but he had learned not to internalize others' emotions or feel responsible for managing their comfort. His therapist at Pine Ridge Veterans Hospital had worked with him extensively on maintaining boundaries and not absorbing the negative energy that surrounded him in civilian environments. The skills that had kept him alive in combat zones, situational awareness, emotional regulation, strategic patience, served him well in navigating the smaller irritations of daily life. Maybe he's picking up medication for someone else and doesn't know what he's doing, Linda speculated, her real estate training making her naturally inclined to create narratives that explained people's behavior. That would explain why everything's taking so long. Her assumption was that anyone moving at Marcus's deliberate pace must be uncertain or unprepared, rather than simply thorough and unhurried. Jake pulled out his smartphone and began scrolling through emails, making a show of the important business he was conducting while waiting in line. "I've got 3 client calls to make before 5, he announced to no one in particular, his statement designed to emphasize his busy professional schedule and contrast it with the apparent leisure of those around him. The implication was clear. His time was valuable, and others should recognize and accommodate that value. The assumptions being made about Marcus were completely wrong, but they followed a pattern he had encountered frequently since leaving the military. Civilian society often struggled to recognize the discipline and capability that veterans carried with them, instead interpreting their measured approach to life as lack of ambition or purpose. Marcus had learned not to take these misperceptions personally, understanding that they said more about the observers than about him. "You know what's really frustrating?" Linda continued, warming to the conversation. "People who don't prepare properly and then hold up everyone else. If you're going to the pharmacy, have your insurance card ready. Know what you're picking up. Don't just wander up to the counter like you've never been there before." Her critique was aimed at inefficient customers in general, but her gaze kept returning to Marcus as the embodiment of whatever was slowing down their afternoon. Jake nodded emphatically at Linda's observation. "Exactly. This is basic consideration for other people. Some of us have schedules to keep." He checked his watch again, calculating how much time this pharmacy stop was costing him and wondering if he should have chosen a different location with faster service. His business success had been built on efficiency and quick decision-making, qualities that seemed to be lacking in the environment around him. What neither Jake nor Linda could see was the military bearing that Marcus carried like second nature, the way he maintained situational awareness without appearing vigilant, the disciplined posture that looked casual but was actually precisely controlled, the patient alertness that came from years of training in environments where hasty decisions could be fatal. They saw only what they expected to see, someone moving slowly through a routine task without apparent urgency. Marcus had encountered this pattern of assumptions countless times since his return to civilian life. People saw his deliberate pace and calm demeanor and interpreted them through the lens of their own values and expectations. Busy professionals assumed he lacked drive. Social networkers assumed he was outside their important circles. Efficiency experts assumed he was simply slow or unprepared. None of them considered that his approach to life might be informed by experiences they couldn't imagine. The conversation between Jake and Linda continued to build, feeding on their shared frustration and mutual validation. They had found common ground in their impatience, and were using Marcus as a symbol of everything that was wrong with people who didn't share their sense of urgency. Their critique expanded beyond the immediate situation to include broader observations about work ethic, personal responsibility, and social consideration. "I bet he's one of those people who pays with exact change," Jake said, eliciting a knowing laugh from Linda. "Counting out pennies while everyone behind him waits." The image he painted was of someone so disconnected from social norms that he would prioritize his own convenience over everyone else's time. It was a caricature that bore no resemblance to the disciplined veteran standing patiently in front of them. Marcus continued to wait without visible reaction to the commentary behind him, though every word registered with the acute hearing that military service had developed. He had learned to distinguish between genuine threats and mere annoyance, and the complaints of impatient civilians definitely fell into the latter category. His focus remained on the present moment and the simple task of picking up his medication, refusing to let external irritation disrupt his internal calm. The assumptions and dismissals continued to flow between Jake and Linda, each comment building on the last, to create a narrative about Marcus that was entirely fictional, but felt satisfying to those creating it. They had successfully transformed their own impatience into a judgment about someone else's character, deflecting their frustration onto a convenient target who seemed unlikely to defend himself. It was a small act of social aggression disguised as reasonable observation, the kind of casual cruelty that often went unnoticed and unchallenged. As the line finally began moving forward and Marcus approached the pharmacy counter, neither Jake nor Linda had any idea that they were about to witness something that would completely shatter their assumptions about the man they had been so quick to dismiss and criticize. The quiet-strength Marcus stepped forward to the pharmacy counter, with the same measured composure he had maintained throughout the wait, seemingly unaffected by the growing chorus of impatience behind him. His approach to the service window demonstrated the kind of respectful efficiency that military training instilled. He had his identification ready, his insurance information organized, and a clear understanding of what he needed to accomplish. The casual dismissal from other customers hadn't penetrated his carefully constructed emotional armor, but it hadn't gone unnoticed either. "Good afternoon," Marcus said to Sarah Mitchell, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of leadership under pressure. There was nothing flashy or demanding in his greeting, but there was an unmistakable quality of someone accustomed to being taken seriously when it mattered. His tone was respectful but confident, the voice of someone who understood hierarchy and protocol but wasn't intimidated by either. Sarah looked up from her computer terminal and immediately noticed something different about this customer. After years of working with the public, she had developed an instinct for reading people, and something about Marcus's bearing suggested depth beneath the surface casualness. His posture was relaxed but alert, his eye contact direct but not aggressive, and his overall presence suggested someone accustomed to navigating complex situations with calm competence. "I'm here to pick up prescriptions for Marcus Chen," he said, providing his date of birth and insurance information with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested he took the process seriously but wasn't overwhelmed by it. His approach was neither rushed nor dawdling, simply methodical and thorough, ensuring that everything would be handled correctly on the first attempt. Behind him, Jake Williams made no effort to lower his voice as he continued his commentary. "Finally," he said with exaggerated relief, "maybe now we can get moving." His assumption was that Marcus would prove to be as inefficient at the counter as he had been in line, creating further delays through uncertainty or poor preparation. The irony that Marcus was actually one of the most prepared customers Sarah had served that day was lost on Jake entirely. Linda Thompson checked her phone and made a show of sighing audibly, her real estate training making her naturally inclined to create subtle pressure for faster service. "I hope this doesn't take much longer," she said, speaking loudly enough to be overheard. "Some of us have client appointments to keep." Her implication was that Marcus's business was less important than hers, deserving of less time and attention from the pharmacy staff. Marcus registered these comments with the same situational awareness that had kept him alive in hostile territory, but his response was to remain even more focused on his interaction with Sarah. He understood that allowing himself to be rushed or irritated would only create the kind of mistakes that would actually slow down the process. His military training had taught him that the best response to external pressure was internal discipline and precision. "I see you're picking up your monthly prescriptions," Sarah said as she pulled up his file on the computer. "Everything should be ready." We filled them this morning." Her professional efficiency was matched by a subtle recognition that this customer was different from the typical pharmacy visitor. Something about his calm competence reminded her of the soldiers she had worked with during her deployment, though she couldn't quite place what was triggering that association. "That's right," Marcus confirmed. "No changes to dosages or anything like that. Same medications as last month." His response demonstrated the kind of thorough knowledge of his own medical care that impressed healthcare professionals. He wasn't someone who showed up unprepared or confused about his treatment regimen. He was clearly taking an active and informed role in managing his health. The exchange between Marcus and Sarah was conducted with the kind of professional courtesy that both had learned in their respective service careers. Neither was wasting time, but neither was cutting corners either. They understood that some processes required attention to detail and couldn't be safely rushed, regardless of external pressure. Their interaction had the quality of two competent professionals, respecting each other's expertise. Jake Williams, however, interpreted their thorough approach as unnecessary delay. "Come on," he muttered, loud enough to be clearly audible at the counter. "How complicated can this be? Get the pills, take the money, next customer." His business background had given him a transactional view of service interactions focused on speed and efficiency rather than accuracy and care. Marcus paused for just a moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as Jake's comment registered. For someone who didn't know him well, the reaction would have been invisible, but Sarah caught it, a flash of something deeper beneath the patient exterior. It wasn't anger exactly, but it was a reminder that patience had limits and that dismissive treatment was being noted and assessed. "The pain medication requires an additional verification," Sarah explained as she worked through the computer system. "It'll just take a moment to complete the security check." Her explanation was directed to Marcus, but it was spoken loudly enough for those behind him to understand that the delay wasn't due to inefficiency or poor preparation. It was a required safety protocol that applied to controlled substances. Linda Thompson rolled her eyes dramatically. "Of course there's another step," she said to Jake, as if Marcus were personally responsible for pharmaceutical regulations. "There's always something with people who don't plan ahead." Her assumption was that a more organized customer would have anticipated and avoided whatever complication was causing the delay. The irony of Linda's comment wasn't lost on Marcus, who had been planning ahead for potential complications since before either of his critics had finished college. His military experience had taught him to expect delays, build buffers into schedules, and maintain equipment and supplies well in advance of when they would be needed. The idea that he was somehow unprepared was so far from reality that it almost made him smile. Sarah completed the verification process and began gathering Marcus's medications from the dispensing area behind the counter. As she moved, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing just a glimpse of the intricate tattoo around her wrist. Marcus noticed the movement peripherally, but was focused on answering her questions about potential side effects and medication interactions. "Any changes in how you're tolerating the current dosages?" Sarah asked, her clinical training evident in the way she assessed Marcus's condition while maintaining professional boundaries. "Any new symptoms or concerns I should note in your file?" Her questions demonstrated the kind of thorough patient care that distinguished good pharmacists from those who simply filled prescriptions mechanically. Marcus appreciated her attention to detail and took a moment to consider his response carefully. "Everything's been working well," he said. "No new side effects, and the current dosages seem to be managing the symptoms effectively." His answer showed the kind of self-awareness and medical literacy that came from taking an active role in his treatment, rather than passively following instructions. Behind him, the impatience was reaching a crescendo. Jake had moved to checking his watch every 30 seconds, making increasingly obvious displays of his frustration. Linda had begun a whispered phone conversation about rescheduling her next appointment, speaking loudly enough to ensure that everyone around her understood the inconvenience she was experiencing. But Marcus remained focused on completing his transaction properly, understanding that rushing through important medical interactions was never worth the potential consequences. His approach to the pharmacy visit was the same as his approach to equipment maintenance or mission planning: thorough, systematic, and designed to prevent problems rather than create them. Sarah handed him the medication bags and receipt, along with the standard counseling information about proper storage and administration. "Everything looks good," she said. "Same schedule as before, and call if you have any questions or concerns." Her professionalism was tinged with something that might have been respect for a customer who took his healthcare seriously and treated pharmacy staff as medical professionals rather than service workers. "Thank you," Marcus said, his gratitude genuine and complete. "I appreciate your thoroughness." He gathered his items efficiently and prepared to leave, maintaining the same measured pace that had characterized his entire interaction. The business was complete, conducted exactly as it should have been, with attention to detail and respect for proper procedures. As he turned to leave, Marcus caught the eye of Jake Williams for just a moment. The look wasn't confrontational or aggressive, but it carried weight. The quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, but plenty he could demonstrate if necessary. It was the kind of look that suggested depths beneath the surface, experiences that couldn't be easily categorized or dismissed. Jake faltered slightly under that brief scrutiny, some instinct warning him that his assumptions about this man might have been premature. But the moment passed quickly, and Marcus moved toward the pharmacy exit with the same calm competence he had displayed throughout the interaction. Behind him, the line moved forward, and the complaints about delays began to fade as attention shifted to the next transaction. Neither Jake nor Linda had any idea that they had just witnessed a masterclass in grace under pressure, delivered by someone whose definition of real pressure bore no resemblance to waiting in line at a pharmacy. They had seen only what they expected to see, missing entirely the quiet strength that had carried Marcus through challenges they couldn't begin to imagine. The moment of recognition. Sarah Mitchell reached up to retrieve a bottle from the high shelf behind the pharmacy counter, her white coat sleeve sliding up her arm as she stretched. The fluorescent lighting caught the intricate details of her tattoo with perfect clarity. Every line of the medical caduceus, every scale on the intertwined serpents, every carefully crafted feather that resembled helicopter rotor blades. For Marcus Chen, who had just turned to gather his medication bags, the world suddenly stopped. The prescription bottle slipped from his fingers, hitting the pharmacy counter with small plastic sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly charged atmosphere. Marcus's face went completely white, the color draining so rapidly that Sarah immediately noticed and turned toward him with professional concern. But it wasn't the look of someone experiencing a medical emergency. It was the expression of someone seeing an impossibility made real, a ghost materialized in broad daylight. Marcus's eyes were locked on Sarah's wrist with an intensity that made her unconsciously pull her sleeve back down, though the movement came too late. He had seen everything. The distinctive serpent scales that formed Pashto script, the helicopter blade wings, and most impossibly, the GPS coordinates that were burned into his own memory with traumatic precision. Those numbers marked the exact location where Tommy Rodriguez had died, pulling Marcus from a burning vehicle, where a brave medic had made the ultimate sacrifice to save a fellow soldier's life. "That's not possible," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying such raw shock that it cut through the ambient noise of the busy pharmacy. His hands were trembling as he reached for the counter to steady himself, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered by what he had just witnessed. The controlled breathing techniques his therapist had taught him were useless against the flood of memories and impossible questions that crashed over him. Sarah looked down at her own wrist, then back at Marcus's stricken face, a growing awareness dawning that this wasn't a casual recognition of her medical tattoo. Something about his reaction suggested a connection far deeper and more personal than a fellow healthcare worker appreciating her ink. The way he was staring at her, the complete shock in his expression, the whispered denial, this was someone seeing something that challenged his understanding of reality. Behind them, Jake Williams and Linda Thompson had been preparing their own complaints about the transaction taking longer than expected, but Marcus's dramatic reaction brought their conversations to an abrupt halt. The sight of a grown man apparently on the verge of collapse at a pharmacy counter triggered their curiosity, though neither had any context for understanding what they were witnessing. "Sir, are you all right?" Sarah asked, her medical training immediately engaging as she assessed Marcus for signs of a health emergency. His color was returning slowly, but his hands were still shaking, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. She moved closer to the counter, ready to call for emergency assistance if his condition deteriorated further. Marcus struggled to form words, his mind racing between the impossibility of what he was seeing and the absolute certainty of what he remembered. Tommy Rodriguez was dead. Marcus had watched him die, had held his hand as the medic's life bled out into the Afghan sand. The tattoo on Tommy's wrist had been the last thing Marcus had seen before the explosion that had knocked him unconscious and left him buried under twisted metal. So how was that same distinctive tattoo now staring back at him from a pharmacy in Colorado? Tommy? Marcus managed to say, the name emerging as a question filled with desperate hope and confused terror. Tommy Rodriguez? His voice cracked on the syllables. 6 years of grief and survivor's guilt concentrated into those 2 words. The name hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm of time and circumstance. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Nobody in Riverside knew that name. Nobody connected her current identity with her military service record. She had legally changed her name after leaving the Army, part of a complete transformation that had allowed her to build a new life away from the memories that had threatened to consume her. Hearing Tommy's name spoken by this stranger felt like having her carefully constructed world suddenly exposed to harsh light. "How do you know that name?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the internal earthquake that Marcus's recognition had triggered. Her training kicked in, the same hypervigilance that had kept her alive in Afghanistan now focused on assessing this unexpected threat to her anonymity. But even as she spoke, pieces were beginning to fall into place. Marcus's bearing, his respectful competence, the way he carried himself suggested military background. The pharmacy around them continued to buzz with normal afternoon activity, but the space immediately around Marcus and Sarah had become a pocket of suspended time where past and present collided. Other customers were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening at the counter, though none could understand the significance of what they were witnessing. Marcus was struggling to process what Sarah's question implied. If she knew the name Tommy Rodriguez, if she was defensive about it, then the impossible might actually be true. But Tommy had been male, and Tommy was dead. Marcus had been at the memorial service, had spoken to Tommy's family, had carried the guilt of Tommy's sacrifice for 6 years. Nothing about this situation made sense. Yet the evidence was literally written in ink on Sarah's skin. "Forward operating base Thunder," Marcus said, the words coming out like a test, a probe to determine how much of his shattered worldview might need to be rebuilt. Kandahar Province. IED attack on supply convoy, July 15, 2018. Each detail was offered like a piece of a puzzle, waiting to see if Sarah could provide the connecting elements that would make the impossible situation comprehensible. Sarah's professional composure finally cracked. Those details weren't public information. They were part of classified mission reports that only participants would know. The date, the location, the type of attack. Marcus wasn't guessing or fishing for information. He was recounting shared history, memories that belonged to both of them despite the impossibility of his presence here. "Marcus Chen," Sarah said, his name falling from her lips with the weight of recognition and disbelief. 3rd Infantry Division, Vehicle Commander. She paused, studying his face as memory and reality aligned. "You were unconscious when they medevaced you. They told me you didn't remember anything about the extraction." The pharmacy counter between them might as well have been the distance between past and present, between death and life, between the person Tommy Rodriguez had been and the person Sarah Mitchell had become. Marcus was looking at her with the kind of desperate intensity that came from seeing proof that everything he thought he knew about the most traumatic day of his life was wrong. "They told me you died," Marcus said, his voice breaking with 6 years of accumulated grief and guilt. At the memorial service, they said you died getting me out of the vehicle. Your sister Elena spoke, and your parents, and they all talked about how you gave your life to save mine. The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly might make them less painful or less confusing. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of what Marcus's presence meant, settling over her like a familiar burden. The memorial service he was describing had been for Tommy Rodriguez, the person she had been before everything changed. But she wasn't dead. She was standing in a pharmacy in Colorado, living a life that was supposed to have ended in the desert 6 years ago. Behind them, the growing crowd of curious onlookers was beginning to attract attention from other pharmacy staff. Jake Williams and Linda Thompson had moved closer, their impatience forgotten in the face of what appeared to be a deeply personal drama unfolding at the prescription counter. Neither understood what they were witnessing, but both recognized that it was significant. "We need to talk," Sarah said quietly, her decision made in the space between heartbeats. "But not here." She glanced around at the interested faces surrounding them, understanding that this conversation required privacy and time. "My shift ends in an hour. Can you wait?" Marcus nodded, still too stunned to do anything but follow her lead. The impossible had become real, and he was going to need time to understand what that meant for everything he thought he knew about Tommy Rodriguez's sacrifice, his own survival, and the guilt he had carried for 6 years. The moment of recognition was complete, but it had raised more questions than it had answered. In a small-town pharmacy in Colorado, two people who should never have met again were about to begin untangling a story that had been buried under layers of official records, classified missions, and carefully constructed new identities. The coffee shop 3 blocks from Mercy General Pharmacy was nearly empty at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, the post-lunch crowd long gone, and the evening rush still hours away. Sarah Mitchell sat across from Marcus Chen in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug as if the warmth could steady the trembling that had started the moment she agreed to this conversation. The familiar weight of her secret felt different now, not like armor protecting her from the past, but like chains that had finally been discovered and were about to be unlocked. "I need you to understand something before I explain," Sarah began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed difficult conversations but never imagined having this particular one. "Everything I'm about to tell you was classified at the highest levels. The mission, the circumstances, what happened afterward, none of it was supposed to become public knowledge. Ever." She paused, studying Marcus's face for signs that he understood the gravity of what she was about to reveal. Marcus leaned forward, his full attention focused on Sarah, with the intensity of someone who had waited 6 years for answers to questions that had consumed his thoughts and shaped his nightmares. "I've been living with survivor's guilt for half a decade," he said quietly. "I've been to therapy, support groups, memorial services for someone I thought died saving my life. Whatever you need to tell me, I can handle it." Sarah took a deep breath, organizing thoughts and memories that she had carefully compartmentalized for years. "Tommy Rodriguez did save your life," she said. "But Tommy Rodriguez didn't die that day. Tommy Rodriguez did save your life, which from a military perspective amounts to the same thing." The distinction was crucial, and she could see Marcus struggling to understand what she meant by the careful word choice. "The mission briefing that morning was routine," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone recounting events from a perspective of hard-won distance. "We were part of a medical support unit attached to your convoy, providing emergency care capabilities for what intelligence suggested would be a standard supply, run through relatively secure territory. My role was as lead medic, responsible for immediate trauma response if any vehicle took casualties." Marcus remembered that morning with the crystalline clarity that trauma sometimes provides. The briefing had indeed seemed routine, another supply run in what had become a series of increasingly frequent missions to maintain forward operating bases throughout the region. The presence of medical support hadn't seemed unusual. It was standard protocol for convoys traveling through areas where insurgent activity remained a possibility. "What we weren't told," Sarah said, her voice hardening slightly, was that our convoy was carrying something more than standard supplies. Hidden among the routine equipment and provisions were components for a classified weapons system that several nations were very interested in acquiring. Our route had been compromised weeks before we ever left base, and the attack was specifically designed to capture those components. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The attack that had nearly killed him, that had claimed the lives of 3 soldiers and left 2 others permanently disabled, hadn't been a random insurgent strike or a crime of opportunity. It had been a targeted operation based on intelligence that suggested their convoy was carrying something valuable enough to justify significant risk and resources. The IED that hit your vehicle was precisely placed, Sarah continued, her medical training evident in the clinical way she described the tactical situation. The insurgents knew exactly which vehicle in the convoy would be carrying the most valuable cargo, and they positioned the explosive to disable rather than destroy. They wanted the contents intact, which means they also wanted survivors who could be interrogated about additional shipments. Marcus felt the foundations of his understanding shifting beneath him. For 6 years he had processed the attack as a tragic but routine hazard of military service in a hostile region. Learning that he and his fellow soldiers had been deliberately targeted, that their lives had been risked for a mission they weren't even fully briefed on, changed the entire context of what had happened. When the explosion went off, you were trapped in the vehicle with severe injuries and possible internal bleeding, Sarah said, her voice becoming more clinical as she recounted the medical emergency. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. We had multiple casualties, hostile forces converging on our position, and extraction helicopters still 20 minutes out. Standard protocol would have been to focus on the most salvageable casualties first. The phrase "most salvageable casualties" hung in the air between them like a judgment that had been rendered and then somehow overturned. Marcus understood battlefield triage well enough to know that a soldier trapped in a burning vehicle with unknown internal injuries would not have been the highest priority for medical attention when resources were limited and time was critical. "But you didn't follow standard protocol," Marcus said, beginning to understand the scope of what Sarah had risked to save his life. Military medical personnel were trained to make brutal calculations about who could be saved with available resources, and those decisions were supposed to be based on clinical assessment rather than personal attachment or emotional considerations. Sarah nodded, her expression carrying the weight of a decision that had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. "I made a choice that violated my training, my orders, and my duty to the broader mission," she said. "I prioritized extracting you from that vehicle over treating casualties who had better chances of survival. By the time I got you stabilized and loaded for evacuation, 2 soldiers who might have been saved with immediate attention had died from their injuries." The confession settled between them like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that would continue to spread long after the words had been spoken. Marcus was beginning to understand that the guilt he had carried for 6 years was nothing compared to the burden Sarah had been bearing. Not just the weight of having survived, but the knowledge that her decision to save his life had directly cost others theirs. The official investigation concluded that those soldiers died from the severity of their initial injuries, Sarah continued. But I knew better. I had violated fundamental principles of battlefield medicine, and people had died because of my choice. The guilt was overwhelming, but the real crisis came when I realized that I couldn't guarantee I wouldn't make the same choice again under similar circumstances. Marcus was struggling to process the implications of what Sarah was telling him. The Tommy Rodriguez who had saved his life hadn't been a hero making a split-second decision under fire. He had been a medical professional deliberately choosing to abandon his training and duty to save one specific person. The nobility he had attributed to his rescue was complicated by the knowledge that it had come at such a devastating cost. The military brass had their own concerns about what had happened, Sarah said, her tone suggesting that the official response had been driven by considerations beyond medical ethics. The weapons components that the convoy had been carrying never made it to their destination, and there were questions about whether the insurgents had succeeded in capturing them. More importantly, There were questions about how the enemy had known exactly where to position their attack. The implication was clear. Someone had provided intelligence to the insurgents, either deliberately or through operational security failures, that had compromised the mission before it began. In the aftermath of an operation that had resulted in multiple casualties and the potential loss of classified military technology, the last thing military leadership wanted was additional scrutiny about medical decisions that violated established protocols. They offered me a choice, Sarah said, her voice becoming flat and emotionless in the way that people adopt when discussing trauma they've processed but not resolved. I could face a court-martial for dereliction of duty and violation of medical protocols, with the understanding that the proceedings would become public and raise questions about the classified nature of the mission, or I could accept a medical discharge for psychological trauma, with the understanding that Tommy Rodriguez would officially be listed as killed in action. Marcus felt his worldview reshaping itself around this new information. The memorial service he had attended, the grief he had shared with Tommy's family, the guilt he had carried for surviving when his rescuer had not. All of it had been based on an official fiction created to protect classified operations and avoid uncomfortable questions about command decisions and medical ethics. I chose to disappear, Sarah said simply. Tommy Rodriguez died in that desert, along with the person I had been before I made the decision to save your life at the cost of others. The woman sitting across from you now is someone different, someone who had to rebuild her entire identity around the knowledge of what she was capable of when faced with an impossible choice. The transformation she was describing went far beyond a simple name change or relocation. Sarah had fundamentally altered her relationship with medicine, with military service, with her own sense of professional identity. The confident combat medic who had served at Forward Operating Base Thunder had died along with the official Tommy Rodriguez, replaced by someone who understood the terrible weight of life and death decisions. The tattoo, Marcus said, finally understanding the significance of the intricate design that had triggered this impossible reunion. It's not just a memorial, it's a confession. The GPS coordinates, the helicopter blades, the Pashto script, every element was a reminder of the choice Sarah had made and the consequences that had followed. Sarah touched her wrist unconsciously, feeling the raised lines of the tattoo beneath her sleeve. Every day I work in that pharmacy, I see those coordinates, she said. I remember exactly where I was standing when I decided that your life was worth more than following protocol. I remember the faces of the soldiers who died while I was focused on saving you. It's my reminder that good intentions don't absolve us of responsibility for our choices. The coffee shop around them continued its quiet afternoon rhythm, but the conversation had created a bubble of intense intimacy, where past and present collided with devastating force. Marcus was grappling with the realization that his survival had come at a cost he had never imagined, while Sarah was confronting the return of someone whose existence she had spent 6 years trying to process and integrate into her new identity. The hardest part, Sarah continued, wasn't the guilt or the career change or even the identity reconstruction. It was knowing that you would never know the truth about what happened, that you would spend your life believing in a version of events that was designed to protect military interests rather than honor the reality of what people sacrificed. Marcus reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with his own, the gesture carrying 6 years of gratitude and a new understanding of what that gratitude truly meant. I don't know how to thank someone for saving my life when I understand what it cost you, he said. But I also don't know how to apologize for being worth saving when others weren't. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears she had been holding back for 6 years. You don't do either, she said. You just live. You make the life I gave you worth the price that was paid for it. That's the only way any of this makes sense. The hidden past had finally emerged, but with it came new responsibilities and new questions about what justice looked like when heroism and tragedy were inextricably intertwined. The trial by fire, the July heat in Kandahar province was unlike anything Sarah Rodriguez had experienced during her deployment, a crushing weight that made every movement deliberate and every breath a conscious effort. Forward Operating Base Thunder sat like a metal island in an ocean of red dust, its fortified walls and guard towers offering protection from external threats but no relief from the relentless Afghan sun. Sarah had been stationed there for 8 months as part of a medical unit that provided trauma care for the scattered outposts and patrol bases that dotted the volatile region. As the lead medic for Echo Company, Sarah had earned a reputation for clinical excellence and unshakable composure under pressure. Her fellow soldiers called her Doc, with the kind of respect that was earned through competence rather than rank, and her ability to remain calm during the most chaotic medical emergencies had saved more lives than anyone bothered to count. She approached military medicine with the same methodical precision that characterized the best battlefield medics: thorough preparation, rapid assessment, and decisive action based on training rather than emotion. The morning of July 15th began like dozens of others, with a pre-dawn briefing for a routine supply convoy that would deliver equipment and provisions to 3 forward operating bases along a corridor that intelligence reports suggested was relatively secure. Sarah's role was standard for such missions: travel with the convoy as mobile medical support, ready to provide immediate trauma care if any vehicle took casualties during the approximately 6-hour round trip. What made this mission different from the routine supply runs that had become increasingly frequent was information that wouldn't be shared with the medical personnel until much later. Hidden among the standard military supplies were components for a classified weapons system that had been developed specifically for counterinsurgency operations in mountainous terrain. The technology was sensitive enough that several foreign intelligence services were actively seeking to acquire examples, making any convoy carrying such equipment a high-value target. The convoy consisted of 6 vehicles, 4 heavily armored trucks carrying supplies and equipment, 1 command vehicle with communications gear and tactical coordination capabilities, and 1 medical transport that could serve as a mobile treatment facility if casualties required immediate intervention before evacuation to the base hospital. Sarah rode in the medical vehicle, along with 2 medics from different units and a full complement of trauma care equipment that could handle everything from minor injuries to life-threatening battlefield wounds. Marcus Chen's vehicle was the 3rd truck in the convoy, positioned behind the lead scout vehicle and the command truck but ahead of the 2 trailing supply vehicles. As vehicle commander, Marcus was responsible for navigation, communication with convoy leadership, and coordination with the 3 soldiers under his direct command. His driver was a 20-year-old private from Texas named Rodriguez, who had been in country for only 3 months, and his gunner was a seasoned sergeant from Ohio who had already completed 2 deployments in different regions of Afghanistan. The route they followed that morning had been used successfully dozens of times over the previous 6 months, winding through valleys and along ridge lines that provided good visibility and multiple options for tactical positioning if the convoy encountered problems. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent activity in the region had decreased significantly following a series of successful operations that had disrupted local command structures and supply lines. But the intelligence reports were wrong, or more precisely, they failed to account for the fact that insurgent forces had received advance information about the convoy's cargo and route. The attack that would nearly kill Marcus and fundamentally change Sarah's life had been planned for weeks, with explosive devices positioned at precisely calculated locations and assault teams positioned to exploit the tactical vulnerabilities that the attack would create. The IED that destroyed Marcus's vehicle was a sophisticated device that had been designed not just to inflict casualties, but to create specific types of tactical problems that would force the convoy into predictable response patterns. The explosion occurred at a point where the road narrowed between rocky outcroppings, making it impossible for vehicles to maneuver around the disabled truck while simultaneously providing insurgent fighters with elevated positions for direct fire attacks. When the explosion erupted beneath Marcus's vehicle, the blast lifted the heavily armored truck completely off the ground before slamming it back down at an angle that crushed the front end and trapped the occupants inside. The driver was killed instantly by the initial blast, while the gunner suffered massive internal injuries that would prove fatal despite immediate medical attention. Marcus was knocked unconscious by the concussion, but remained alive, trapped in the wreckage, With multiple fractures and possible internal bleeding, Sarah's medical training immediately engaged as she assessed the tactical situation from her position in the convoy's medical vehicle. Multiple casualties requiring immediate attention, hostile forces initiating contact from concealed positions, and a disabled vehicle blocking the convoy's ability to continue along the planned route. The standard protocol for such situations was clear: secure the area, assess casualties by priority of medical need, and coordinate with evacuation assets to remove wounded personnel as quickly as possible. But the tactical situation was deteriorating faster than standard protocols anticipated. The insurgent attack had been carefully planned to create maximum confusion and force difficult choices about resource allocation. Small arms fire was coming from multiple directions, making it dangerous for medical personnel to move between casualties, while the positioning of the IED had created a choke point that made the entire convoy vulnerable to additional explosive devices. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and began moving toward the casualties, but the scene that greeted her challenged every aspect of her training and experience. The driver of Marcus's vehicle was clearly beyond help, his injuries incompatible with life despite any medical intervention. The gunner was critically wounded but might be stabilized with immediate attention and rapid evacuation. Marcus was unconscious and trapped, his condition unknown but his position making him difficult to reach safely. According to the triage protocols that govern battlefield medicine, Sarah should have focused first on the casualties who could be definitively saved with available resources, then moved to those whose conditions were uncertain but potentially treatable. Marcus's situation, trapped, unconscious, and requiring complex extraction before medical assessment could even begin, made him a lower priority than soldiers who were accessible and whose injuries could be immediately evaluated. But, as Sarah approached the wreckage, something beyond medical training took control of her decision-making process. Perhaps it was the way Marcus's hand was visible through the twisted metal, moving slightly in a way that suggested consciousness returning. Perhaps it was the recognition that abandoning someone who might be saved violated something deeper than military protocol. Or perhaps it was simply the human inability to make purely clinical calculations when faced with individual suffering. Whatever the motivation, Sarah made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Instead of following triage protocol and treating the most salvageable casualties first, she focused her attention on extracting Marcus from the wreckage. The decision required her to ignore the established procedures that were designed to save the maximum number of lives with limited resources, prioritizing one unclear case over multiple situations where her medical expertise could have made a clear difference. The extraction process was complicated by the ongoing firefight and the precarious position of the damaged vehicle. Sarah had to coordinate with other soldiers to stabilize the wreckage, while she worked to free Marcus from the twisted metal that had trapped him. The process took nearly 20 minutes, time that could have been used to provide life-saving treatment to other casualties who were bleeding out, while she focused on what might have been a futile rescue attempt. By the time Sarah had successfully extracted Marcus and confirmed that his injuries, while serious, were not immediately life-threatening, 2 other soldiers had died from wounds that might have been treatable with prompt medical attention. The gunner from Marcus's vehicle had succumbed to internal bleeding that could have been controlled with proper intervention, and a soldier from another vehicle had died from blood loss that emergency surgery might have prevented. The helicopter evacuation that finally arrived to remove the wounded personnel found a situation that challenged the neat categories of military after-action reports. Some soldiers had been saved through prompt medical intervention. Others had died from wounds that were simply too severe to treat in a battlefield environment, and still others had died from treatable injuries, while medical resources were focused elsewhere. Sarah rode with Marcus during the helicopter evacuation, monitoring his vital signs and coordinating with the receiving hospital about the treatment he would need upon arrival. He remained unconscious throughout the flight, unaware of the cost that his rescue had imposed on others, or the decision that Sarah had made to prioritize his life over established medical protocols. The trial by fire that Sarah had faced in those 20 minutes of chaos would define everything that came afterward. She had been forced to choose between following her training and following her instincts. between saving lives according to established protocols and saving the specific life that seemed most important in that moment. The choice had saved Marcus, but it had also violated fundamental principles of battlefield medicine and resulted in deaths that might have been preventable. In the aftermath of the attack, as casualty reports were filed and equipment losses were assessed, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what had happened. The mission that had seemed routine had actually been compromised from the beginning, targeting soldiers who had been given incomplete information about what they were carrying and why they were at risk. The medical decisions she had made under fire would be scrutinized not just for their clinical validity, but for their impact on a classified operation that had implications far beyond the individual casualties. The trial by fire was complete, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The institutional challenge. The sterile conference room at Bagram Airfield felt more like a courtroom than a medical facility, as Sarah Rodriguez faced the panel of officers who would determine her future in the United States Army. 3 weeks had passed since the convoy attack that had killed 4 soldiers and wounded 6 others, including Marcus Chen, who remained hospitalized but was expected to make a full recovery. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the polished table where Sarah's service record lay open beside incident reports, medical protocols, and witness statements that would either justify or condemn the decisions she had made under fire. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, the senior medical officer conducting the investigation, had built her career on the kind of systematic approach to military medicine that prioritized efficiency, protocol adherence, and measurable outcomes. Her reputation for thorough analysis and uncompromising standards had made her the obvious choice to lead an inquiry into medical decisions that had potentially violated established battlefield protocols. Sitting beside her was Major David Sullivan, a military lawyer whose presence indicated that this review could have consequences extending far beyond Sarah's medical career. Specialist Rodriguez, Colonel Hendricks began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions based on incomplete information. We're here to examine the medical response to the July 15th convoy attack, specifically the triage decisions made during the immediate aftermath of the IED explosion. I want to emphasize that this is an administrative review, not a disciplinary hearing, and our goal is to understand what happened so that we can improve future medical response protocols. The careful phrasing didn't diminish the gravity of what Sarah understood was at stake. Administrative reviews could result in letters of reprimand, changes to military occupational specialty, or recommendations for discharge proceedings. More importantly, the decisions being scrutinized had resulted in deaths that might have been preventable, and no amount of bureaucratic language could soften the moral weight of that reality. I've reviewed your service record, Colonel Hendricks continued, and it's exemplary. Consistently high performance ratings, commendations for medical excellence under pressure, and testimonials from commanding officers who describe you as one of the most competent medics they've worked with. That makes the events of July 15th particularly puzzling, because the decisions you made appear to contradict both your training and your demonstrated expertise in battlefield medicine. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap to prevent them from trembling, as she prepared to defend choices that she wasn't entirely sure she could justify even to herself. The 3 weeks since the attack had given her plenty of time to replay every moment of that chaotic 20-minute period, analyzing alternative decisions that might have resulted in different outcomes. The burden of knowing that her choices had directly contributed to preventable deaths had been consuming her thoughts and disrupting her sleep. Major Sullivan leaned forward, his legal training evident in the careful way he structured his questions. Specialist Rodriguez, I want to make sure you understand the nature of this inquiry. We're not questioning your courage or your commitment to saving lives, but we do need to understand why you chose to focus your medical attention on Sergeant Chen's extraction when other casualties with more urgent medical needs were readily accessible. The question went to the heart of battlefield medicine's most fundamental principle. Triage decisions were supposed to be based on clinical assessment of survivability rather than personal judgment about individual worth. Sarah had been trained to evaluate casualties systematically, prioritizing those who could be saved with available resources over those whose conditions were uncertain or who would require disproportionate time and effort to treat. "Sir, the tactical situation was complex," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully as she attempted to reconstruct decision-making processes that had unfolded under extreme stress. "We had multiple casualties, ongoing hostile fire, and limited time before extraction assets would arrive. The standard triage protocols assume certain baseline conditions that weren't present during this particular engagement." Colonel Hendricks consulted the incident report spread before her. According to witness statements, Private Martinez had sustained abdominal wounds that were bleeding heavily but appeared treatable with immediate intervention. Sergeant Williams had suffered traumatic injuries but was conscious and communicating. Both of these casualties were accessible without the complex extraction that Sergeant Chen's situation required. "Can you explain why you chose to focus on the most difficult extraction rather than treating the most urgent medical needs first?" The question forced Sarah to confront the reality that her decisions couldn't be justified through purely clinical reasoning. Private Martinez and Sergeant Williams had indeed presented more straightforward medical problems that fell within her training and expertise, while Marcus's situation had been complicated by the need for mechanical extraction before medical assessment could even begin. From a resource allocation standpoint, her choice had been inefficient and potentially counterproductive. "Ma'am, I made a field judgment that Sergeant Chen's condition might deteriorate rapidly if extraction was delayed," Sarah said, knowing that her explanation sounded weak even as she spoke. "The vehicle was unstable, there was fuel leakage that created fire risk, and I believed that waiting for engineering support to arrive might result in losing a patient who could otherwise be saved." Major Sullivan made notes as Sarah spoke, his expression suggesting that he found her explanation insufficient to justify the protocol violations that had occurred. "Specialist Rodriguez, your medical training emphasizes systematic assessment and priority-based treatment. The concerns you've mentioned about Sergeant Chen's extraction could apply to any trapped casualty, but that doesn't automatically make them the highest medical priority." The legal implications of the review were becoming clearer as the questioning continued. Sarah's decisions weren't just being evaluated for their medical appropriateness, they were being examined for evidence of negligence, dereliction of duty, or violation of established protocols that could support formal disciplinary action. The deaths of Private Martinez and Sergeant Williams had created a need for institutional accountability, and Sarah's choice to deviate from standard procedures made her a logical focus for that accountability. "There's another aspect of this situation that we need to address," Colonel Hendricks said, her tone shifting to suggest that more sensitive issues were about to be discussed. "The convoy that was attacked on July 15th was carrying classified equipment that has implications for ongoing operations throughout the region. The tactical response to the attack, including medical decisions, is being reviewed not just for clinical appropriateness, but for potential security implications." Sarah felt a chill of understanding wash over her. The convoy attack hadn't been a random insurgent strike. It had been a targeted operation designed to capture or destroy specific military assets. The medical decisions that had seemed like isolated choices made under pressure were now being evaluated as part of a larger operational security review that could have implications far beyond her individual career. "I wasn't informed about classified cargo," Sarah said carefully, recognizing that her knowledge of the convoy's true mission could itself become a security concern. "My medical preparations were based on standard convoy support protocols. I wasn't briefed on any special considerations that might affect triage decisions or casualty evacuation procedures." Major Sullivan exchanged a glance with Colonel Hendricks that suggested they had discussed this aspect of the case before the formal review began. "The classified nature of the mission doesn't change medical protocols," he said. "But it does raise questions about whether the tactical situation was communicated effectively to medical personnel and whether the response procedures were appropriate for the specific threats involved." The institutional challenge was expanding beyond Sarah's individual decisions to encompass broader questions about mission planning, information sharing, and the coordination between combat operations and medical support. But that broader context offered little comfort to Sarah, who understood that institutional failures often required individual scapegoats to maintain the appearance of accountability and control. "Specialist Rodriguez," Colonel Hendricks said, I'm going to be direct with you about the situation you're facing. The medical decisions you made resulted in the deaths of 2 soldiers who might have been saved with different priority allocation. Regardless of your intentions or the complexity of the tactical situation, that outcome creates liability for both you personally and for the Army institutionally. The stark assessment forced Sarah to confront what she had been trying to avoid acknowledging for 3 weeks. Her choice to save Marcus had directly contributed to the deaths of Private Martinez and Sergeant Williams, and no amount of contextual explanation could change that fundamental reality. The institutional review process wasn't designed to explore the moral complexity of impossible choices. It was designed to determine responsibility and assign consequences. However, Colonel Hendricks continued, there are aspects of this situation that complicate any potential disciplinary action. The classified nature of the mission, the intelligence failures that led to the convoy being compromised, and the tactical decisions made by command personnel all contribute to a complex chain of causation that extends far beyond medical response protocols. Sarah began to understand that she was caught in a conflict between institutional needs that had nothing to do with medical ethics or battlefield performance. The Army needed to maintain confidence in its medical protocols, while also protecting classified operations and avoiding public scrutiny of intelligence failures. Her case had become a focal point for competing institutional interests that would determine her fate regardless of the clinical merits of her decisions. "We're prepared to offer you a choice," Major Sullivan said, his legal training evident in the careful way he presented what was clearly a predetermined resolution. "You can request a formal court-martial to contest the findings of medical protocol violations, with the understanding that such proceedings would become public and would require detailed examination of classified operational information. Alternatively, you can accept administrative discharge for medical reasons related to combat stress, which would allow you to maintain your service record and benefits while resolving the institutional concerns raised by this incident." The choice being offered wasn't really a choice at all. It was an institutional solution that would protect classified information while removing Sarah from a situation that had become politically and legally problematic. The administrative discharge would officially attribute her departure to psychological factors rather than medical misconduct, allowing the Army to avoid acknowledging that its medical protocols might be inadequate for complex battlefield situations. "If I accept the medical discharge," Sarah asked, "what happens to the official record of what occurred during the convoy attack? How will the deaths of Private Martinez and Sergeant Williams be explained?" Colonel Hendricks consulted her files before responding. "The official after-action report will attribute their deaths to the severity of their initial injuries and the tactical constraints that limited medical response options. There will be no specific mention of triage decisions or individual medical performance. The classified aspects of the mission will remain protected, and there will be no public examination of operational security failures." Sarah understood that she was being offered a chance to disappear quietly, to avoid formal discipline while allowing the institution to maintain its narratives about medical competence and operational security. But accepting that offer would mean abandoning any possibility of accountability for the deaths that had resulted from her choices, transforming tragedy into bureaucratic convenience. The institutional challenge was complete, but the choice it presented would determine not just Sarah's future, but the official version of events that would shape how Private Martinez, Sergeant Williams, and Marcus Chen were remembered. The evidence surfaces. The small apartment Sarah Mitchell rented on the outskirts of Riverside, Colorado was sparse, but meticulously organized, reflecting the discipline of someone who had learned to live with essential items only. What would have surprised anyone who knew her civilian identity, however, was the locked filing cabinet in her bedroom closet that contained a complete record of her military service, including documents that were never supposed to have left Afghanistan. As she led Marcus through her front door that evening, Sarah understood that the time for protecting those secrets had finally ended. "I need you to see something," Sarah said, moving toward the bedroom with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a difficult decision and was committed to following through completely. "But before I show you, I need you to understand that what I'm about to share with you could have serious legal consequences for both of us. These documents were classified, and my possession of them violates several federal statutes." Marcus followed her into the small bedroom, noting the same careful organization that characterized everything else about Sarah's civilian life. The furniture was functional rather than decorative. The walls were bare, except for a single landscape photograph of Colorado mountains, and the overall atmosphere suggested someone who was prepared to relocate quickly if circumstances required it. When Sarah opened the closet and revealed the locked filing cabinet, however, Marcus began to understand that her simple lifestyle was more about concealment than preference. "I couldn't let them bury the truth," Sarah said as she worked the combination lock on the filing cabinet. The official version of what happened during that convoy attack was designed to protect classified operations and avoid uncomfortable questions about command decisions. But the soldiers who died deserved better than having their deaths explained away as unavoidable casualties of a routine mission gone wrong. The filing cabinet contained dozens of documents that Sarah had systematically copied and preserved during her final weeks of military service. Medical records, incident reports, classified mission briefings, communication transcripts, and witness statements that provided a complete picture of the convoy attack and its aftermath. Each document was organized in labeled folders that demonstrated the methodical approach of someone building a comprehensive case file. "This is the actual mission briefing from July 14th, Sarah said, pulling out a folder marked with classification stamps and distribution limitations. It shows that command knew the convoy was carrying sensitive equipment that made it a high-value target, but medical personnel were never informed about the elevated threat level. We were told it was a routine supply run when it was actually a classified equipment transfer through compromised territory." Marcus studied the document Sarah handed him, recognizing the standard format of military briefing materials, but seeing details that had never been shared with convoy personnel. The mission objectives section described the transport of advanced targeting systems and specialized communications equipment that intelligence reports suggested were being actively sought by insurgent forces and foreign intelligence services. "They knew we were likely to be attacked," Marcus said, the implications of the briefing materials becoming clear as he read through the threat assessment section. "The intelligence annex shows multiple reports of insurgent activity along our planned route, and the tactical analysis suggests that enemy forces had advanced knowledge of convoy schedules and cargo manifests." Sarah nodded grimly as she pulled out additional folders containing communication intercepts and surveillance reports that painted a picture of a mission that had been compromised before it began. Command decided to proceed with the mission despite the known risks because the equipment transfer was considered essential for ongoing operations. But they didn't inform medical personnel about the true nature of what we were protecting or the specific types of threats we might face. The evidence Sarah had preserved demonstrated a pattern of institutional decision-making that prioritized operational security over personnel safety. Medical units had been given standard briefings about convoy support duties while being kept ignorant of intelligence that would have affected their preparation and response protocols. The soldiers who had died during the attack had been unknowingly participating in a classified operation that exposed them to risks they hadn't been trained to address. "This is the after-action report that was filed immediately after the attack," Sarah said, handing Marcus a document that bore little resemblance to his memories of what had actually occurred. "Compare it to this, the witness statements that were collected from survivors before the official narrative was established. You'll see that the reports contradict each other in ways that suggest deliberate editing to support predetermined conclusions." Marcus read through both documents, noting the stark differences between the immediate accounts provided by soldiers who had participated in the battle and the sanitized version that had become the official record. The after-action report attributed all casualties to overwhelming enemy fire and sophisticated explosive devices, while the witness statements described a more complex situation involving tactical confusion, communication failures, and medical decisions that had prioritized some casualties over others. "My medical decisions during the attack were documented in real time by other medics who were present," Sarah continued, producing a folder containing field medical reports that had been filed before the broader investigation began. "These reports show exactly what happened during the casualty treatment phase, including the decision to focus on your extraction rather than treating more urgent cases first. The official investigation buried these reports because they contradicted the narrative that command wanted to establish. The medical documentation was devastating in its clinical precision. Field reports described Sarah's decision to spend 20 crucial minutes extracting Marcus from his damaged vehicle, while other casualties with more straightforward medical needs received delayed treatment. The reports didn't judge the decision as right or wrong, but they provided clear evidence that standard triage protocols had been violated in ways that had directly contributed to preventable deaths. "Why did you keep all of this?" Marcus asked, overwhelmed by the scope of evidence that Sarah had systematically preserved. The risks of possessing classified documents, the potential legal consequences, the personal danger of challenging official military narratives. Why would you take those chances? Sarah sat heavily on her bed, the weight of 6 years of carrying these secrets visible in her posture and expression. "Because the truth mattered more than my safety," she said. "Private Martinez and Sergeant Williams died because of choices I made, and their families deserve to know what really happened. But beyond that, the institutional failures that led to the convoy being compromised were buried, along with the medical decisions. If those failures weren't exposed and addressed, other soldiers would die in similar situations." The email that would change everything arrived at the offices of the Denver Chronicle at 3:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in November, 6 months after Marcus Chen had walked into Mercy General Pharmacy and discovered that his understanding of the past was built on carefully constructed lies. The sender identified herself as Sarah Mitchell, a former Army medic, and the subject line read simply, "Classified military documents. Convoy attack, cover-up. Lives lost due to command negligence." Attached were over 200 pages of documents that investigative journalist Rebecca Martinez would later describe as the most comprehensive evidence of military institutional failure she had encountered in 15 years of covering defense issues. Rebecca had built her reputation on meticulous fact-checking and her ability to navigate the complex legal and ethical challenges of reporting on classified military operations. When she opened Sarah's email that morning, she immediately recognized the potential significance of what she was seeing, but she also understood that verifying the authenticity of the documents and confirming the allegations they supported would require months of careful investigation and multiple independent sources. The initial documents Sarah provided painted a picture of systematic institutional failure that extended far beyond the specific convoy attack that had nearly killed Marcus and had officially claimed the life of Tommy Rodriguez. The evidence suggested a pattern of command decisions that prioritized operational security over personnel safety, intelligence failures that were covered up rather than addressed, and medical protocols that were undermined by inadequate information sharing between different military units. "I've been carrying this truth for 6 years," Sarah had written in her initial email to Rebecca. "The soldiers who died during that convoy attack deserved better than having their deaths explained away as unavoidable casualties of war. Their families deserve to know that preventable failures led to those deaths, and the public deserves to understand how institutional priorities can override the safety of the people we send into harm's way." Rebecca's investigation began with the painstaking process of verifying the authenticity of the documents Sarah had provided. Working with forensic document experts and military analysts, she confirmed that the classification markings, formatting, and content were consistent with legitimate military records from the time period in question. More importantly, she was able to cross-reference information in the documents with other sources, including veterans who had served in the same region and family members of soldiers who had been killed in similar attacks. The breakthrough that transformed Rebecca's investigation from a collection of unverified allegations into a comprehensive exposé came when she located Marcus Chen through military records and convinced him to speak publicly about his experiences. Marcus's decision to go on the record was not made lightly. He understood that challenging official military narratives could have personal and professional consequences that would extend far beyond his own life. "For 6 years, I believed that Tommy Rodriguez had died saving my life," Marcus told Rebecca during their first recorded interview. "I carried guilt and gratitude in equal measure, attending memorial services and speaking to Tommy's family about the heroism of someone I thought had made the ultimate sacrifice. Learning that Tommy had actually survived, that the entire narrative I built my recovery around was a fiction created to protect classified operations, has forced me to re-examine everything I thought I knew about military service and institutional integrity. Rebecca's investigation expanded as other veterans began coming forward with similar stories of operations that had been misrepresented in official records, medical decisions that had been influenced by classification concerns, and families who had been given incomplete or inaccurate information about how the convoy attack that had brought Marcus and Sarah together was revealed to be part of a broader pattern of institutional behavior that prioritized political and operational considerations over transparency and accountability. The decision to publish the exposé was complicated by national security concerns and the potential legal consequences for Sarah, who had violated federal law by retaining classified documents. Rebecca worked with the Denver Chronicle's legal team and consulted with national security experts to ensure that the publication would not compromise ongoing operations, while still revealing the institutional failures that had led to preventable deaths. The public has a right to understand how decisions are made that affect the lives of service members, Rebecca wrote in the introduction to her series. This investigation reveals systematic failures in communication, planning, and accountability that have resulted in deaths that could have been prevented. More importantly, it shows how institutional priorities can create incentives to cover up rather than address these failures, making it more likely that they will be repeated. The first article in Rebecca's series was published on a Thursday morning in May, exactly 1 year after Marcus had encountered Sarah at the pharmacy. The headline read, "Classified Convoy Carried Death Sentence, How Military Secrecy Led to Preventable Casualties in Afghanistan," and the story immediately generated responses from military officials, congressional representatives, and veteran advocacy organizations, who had been waiting for someone to shine light on practices they had long suspected but couldn't prove. Within hours of publication, the Denver Chronicle's website crashed from the volume of traffic as readers shared the story across social media platforms, and news organizations picked up the investigation for their own coverage. The detailed documentation that Sarah had preserved provided a level of evidence that made it impossible for military officials to dismiss the allegations as speculation or misunderstanding. The response from the Department of Defense was swift, but carefully measured. Initial statements acknowledged that the convoy attack had resulted in while military operations involve inherent risks that cannot be completely eliminated through planning or preparation. However, as additional articles in Rebecca's series revealed more evidence of institutional failures, the official responses became more defensive and less credible. Congressional hearings were announced within a week of the first article's publication, with representatives from both parties calling for investigations into the specific failures revealed by Rebecca's reporting, as well as broader examinations of how classification policies might be undermining accountability and transparency in military operations. The House Armed Services Committee scheduled hearings that would require testimony from current and former military officials, including those who had been directly involved in the convoy attack and its aftermath. Veterans organizations that had been advocating for greater transparency in military operations seized on Rebecca's investigation as validation of concerns they had been raising for years. The evidence of systematic institutional failures resonated with veterans who had their own experiences of being given incomplete information about missions, having their concerns dismissed by command structures, or discovering that official accounts of events didn't match their memories of what had actually occurred. "This investigation confirms what many of us have suspected for years," said Patricia Coleman, the National Commander of Veterans for Accountability, an organization that had been formed specifically to address issues of transparency and institutional responsibility in military operations. Service members are being placed at risk by decisions that prioritize political and operational considerations over their safety, and when things go wrong, the instinct is to cover up rather than learn from failures. The personal impact on Sarah and Marcus of becoming public figures in a national controversy was profound and unexpected. Sarah, who had spent 6 years building a quiet civilian life away from her military identity, suddenly found herself at the center of congressional investigations and media attention. Marcus, who had processed his military service through therapy and community support, was forced to relive traumatic experiences in public forums while defending his decision to challenge official narratives. "I never wanted to be a whistleblower or a political figure," Sarah explained during a television interview that aired 2 weeks after the first article was published. "I just wanted the truth about what happened to those soldiers to be known. And I wanted institutional failures to be addressed so that other people wouldn't die from the same problems. But once you start down this path, you don't get to control where it leads." The public revelation had achieved its intended goal of exposing institutional failures and demanding accountability, but it had also created new challenges and responsibilities for everyone involved. The truth that Sarah had preserved and Marcus had helped verify was finally being heard, but the process of transforming that truth into meaningful change was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.